This presentation will refer to the article referenced in this slide. Please use PsycInfo to locate and download a copy of the article to follow along. Writing a survey is sort of like making cookies from a recipe. We have guidance, but we need to make sure we attend to the details. Using an established instrument is more like baking refrigerated dough. If we use sugar cookie dough, it isn't going to make chocolate chip cookies. And if we don't follow the baking instructions, it can go bad. But the content is developed to help make sure we get the outcome we want. Each of those characteristics relates to the reliability and validity of the outcome. In the case of surveys, the reliability and validity of the measure. The article about assessing college students' life stress provides an example of the process that researchers go through to develop a measure. It might be helpful to pause the presentation and read the abstract if you haven't already. In some cases, we will want to create our own measure, maybe because our topic or population is unique. We won't necessarily go through all of the steps these authors went through, but we can think about whether we can use similar processes. The first step in the process, as described on page 256 and 257, was to ask athletes about sources of stress in their life. This allowed the authors to gather information about the definition of stress from the athletes themselves. The authors then went through a series of steps, discussed on page 257, where the authors worked with a group of experts to develop questions for a survey. First, the experts used the information from the athletes and their knowledge to list important factors related to student-athletes' life stress. Then, the authors compiled the information from the experts and developed a list of 70 potential factors related to student life stress. Experts were asked for feedback on that list. Given the feedback, the authors developed 70 potential items or questions and asked the experts to rate them based on their importance. The authors used those ratings to narrow the list to 40 items. If we were writing our own questions for a project, it might not be practical to go through a series of steps like the authors of this instrument, but we would still need to consider the construct validity by making sure our questions were based on established definitions of the variable, findings from other empirical studies, and/or ideas from related non-empirical work. In a second study, detailed on pages 257 to 259, the authors administered the 40 items to 333 college student athletes. They then used statistical analyses, a factor analysis, to identify items that seemed to fit together and represent themes, as well as items that did not seem necessarily to a valid measurement. The result was a 24-item instrument. If we were writing questions, it might not be practical to gather data from several people just to validate our measure. It is important to gather data from at least a few people, a process called a pilot test. During that process, you can ask participants to explain why they answered as they did to ensure the wording and response options were measuring the intended variables. Study 3, discussed on pages 260 and 261, includes testing the internal reliability of the 8 factors, given data from 334 student-athletes from 11 schools. The summary of the results indicated that internal reliability for the factors was acceptable. If we only have 1 or 2 questions, it's not practical to compute the Cronbach's alpha, but with more than 2 items that should be related, we can compute Cronbach's alpha to determine the internal consistency. In the third study, the authors also tested the concurrent discriminant validity. Remember that concurrent validity is one of the types of validity that's concerned with related outcomes. In this case, research indicated that stress is related to outcomes such as burnout, so the authors used a measure of burnout to test for concurrent validity, expecting a significant positive correlation if the two measures are related. Discriminant validity asks whether the survey is measuring a variable that's distinctly different from another variable. In this case, the authors believe that positive state of mind was distinctly different from stress. Given that, discriminant validity would be represented by a negative correlation or no correlation between the stress measure and positive state of mind measure. The results on page 261 suggest that the college students-athletes life stress scale had concurrent validity when using burnout as a related outcome and discriminant validity when using a positive state of mind as a differing variable. If we were writing our own questions, our efforts to establish discriminant or concurrent validity would depend on the purpose of the questions and the practicality of the effort. If the purpose of our questions is relatively straightforward, like determining whether or not a person has done a particular activity, it may not be as important to establish these types of validity. If we are establishing a measure of a more complex variable, however, these efforts are important. Correlations, like those used to determine discriminant and concurrent validity, can be complicated to interpret. First, we have to figure out the tables where they are usually presented. In APA style, correlation tables list each variable in a row and then in a column. The correlation for a pair of variables is placed in the cell where the two variables intersect. For example, in the table from this study, the correlation between sports injury and positive state of mind, abbreviated APS-MS, is in the first row, 9th column. For each of those values, we have to consider if it's a positive or negative, strong or weak, and significant or not. The strong or weak represents the effect size, so we might have a significant correlation that's not very strong. In other words, it's not very meaningful. The stars next to each of the numbers in this table mean that they are significant. But what about the strength? We can think of 0.4 to 0.7 as being moderately strong. Lower is considered weaker, higher is considered stronger. If we are going into greater detail about this measure, we would want to consider which of the correlations we would expect to be strong and in what direction. For now, just keep in mind that we need to keep that in mind. So we've talked about what we would need to do if we were writing our own questions, and we've looked at the college student athlete's life stress scale as an example of developing a measure. What if the population of interest for our project was student athletes? Could we use this measure? We need to start with a few practical questions. First, do we have all 24 items, or the questions, that were included in the scale, or can we find them? In this case, they're included in the appendix for the article on page 267. In some cases, we will need to do a little bit more investigation to find the items, a process that can make us a little sad when we realize we can't find the items, or maybe even worse, we would have to pay to use them. If we can find them, then we ask if we know what the intended response options were. In this case, they are also included in page 267. If we have the items but not the response options, we can usually still work with it, but it's helpful if we know what the authors intended. The last thing we need to know, or figure out, is how to interpret the responses. Basically, we need to know how to combine the information from the various questions. We call that process scoring. Sometimes it is as simple as adding up all of the responses and using that score for the variable. Other times, like with this example, there are separate factors or scales represented, and we need to know what questions go together. That information is included below the questions in the appendix for this measure, but they don't give any other guidance on interpreting or scoring. Given that, it's usually safe to add the scores for the questions. Okay, we have what we need to use the measure, but do we actually want to use it? Given the analysis that was done and the analysis was published in a peer-reviewed journal from a credible publisher, we can be comfortable that the reliability is sufficient, so that is a step in the right direction. But what about validity? The article talks about evidence of the validity of the measure, but we would still need to make sure the questions are consistent with the way we were thinking of the variable. Construct validity is somewhat dependent on context. We'll think through that idea in the related discussion board.